we want to do it in a way that's motivating and inspiring. So we want to make it a little more yes and, like our friends in improv theater. We want to say, here's what you've done really well this year. Here's the big opportunity area where you missed the mark. Here's what you could do next year or starting tomorrow to kind of bridge this gap. But as it stands right now, this is you're behind where I think you could be, and I think where you want to be. We want to be honest in that way, but we want to be honest, candid, but we want to do it with compassion. We want to do it with an eye of coaching. I want to help you get better. This is the Leadership Foundry Podcast. I'm your host this week, Brandon Smith, and joining me this week is my wonderful colleague, friend, producer extraordinaire, Whitney Mendoza. Whitney, how are you?
Great, Brandon. Thank you. Even better after that introduction.
Well deserved, Whitney. Well deserved.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
It's good to have you on the show. So normally, as a Leadership Foundry podcast kind of principle, we always try and highlight leader stories, leaders' journeys, leadership insights along the way, really all about helping the toolkits of leaders get better.
Yes.
Today, we're not necessarily taking on a particular story of a leader, but we're going to talk about something, you and I together today, that is really, really important for leaders today, that we find are struggling with it or figuring out how to do it. And if my colleague and co-founder Randy Hain was with us today, he would be just as passionate about this topic. We're going to talk about accountability. How do you hold someone accountable? How do you create a culture of accountability? And what can we do to make sure we're doing accountability with the right balance of firmness, but also care and compassion? So, we want to give people every opportunity to step up, but if they don't, how do we also take the necessary steps to ensure that it doesn't start to erode the performance of the whole team? Because that's what will happen if everyone's heard the old adage, one bad apple spoils the bunch. This is a great example of that. If we let one person slide, particularly our rock stars, our A players are going to say, what do you mean? I don't get that pass, or I wouldn't give that pass to myself. You're going to let them slide? Well, then I either need to dial back on my effort because it's just not worth it, or I need to find another home. And we can't have that happen. So accountability is a really big, important topic. So I'm curious, Whitney, when you think about accountability, does it conjure up the same kind of importance for you? What do you think about?
Yes, absolutely. I feel the same passion, I think was the word. Sometimes, I feel like as employees, we can also feel angry about this, right? Because to your point, we feel like we're coming to work, we're working hard, we have measures in place that are supposed to keep employees safe and that are supposed to guide how we conduct ourselves in the workplace. Companies have meetings to come up with those guidelines. We have meetings to set the path straight. We have meetings to discipline. Like a lot of things happen around this, including both time and money. So there's multiple facets going into this. And it's almost like sometimes as soon as you walk out of that meeting, it's like it never happened because there's no follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to channel my good friend Randy Hain here, because I think the antidote for this, we're going to talk about three important ingredients to help us do this right. We're going to talk about clarity. We're going to talk about kind of ongoing regular communication, and we're going to talk about candor. Nice. You can remember the 3 C's. And Randy, anyone who knows Randy, has spent time with Randy, had the opportunity to have Randy as your coach, which is a real gift. He is an absolute champion of clarity and candor and communication. So this is right in his wheelhouse. But it's all really, really important. So let's talk about what happens what leads us into this problem in the first place. One of the prevailing issues that makes accountability a problem is we get into performance review time, and we haven't either had the conversations along the way, we haven't done clarity, communication, candor, and now we got a performance review and you're feeling kind of bad, and this person worked really hard this year and they're kind of tired, even though they didn't do a very good job, but they did okay, but not great. You don't want them to leave. So we give them all exceeds expectations on their review. And we do it the next year. And we do it the next year. And we do it the next year. And then now we've got this entire group of B, C players that all think they're A players, but they're not. And now you got a leader that came in and said, hey, we need to clean this up. Ooh, I don't want to be in that predicament where now you got to tell someone for years you've been telling them they exceeded expectations. You go, yeah, actually, you're not really that good. Actually, this whole time you've basically barely met expectations. Sorry. So think about that. In the moment, we thought we were being nice to them when we gave them exceeds expectations. Like we're like, oh, aren't they going to be so excited about this? We think we're being kind and generous. Actually, what we're doing is we're being selfish. We're delivering that message so they leave happy and we feel good.
Wow. Yeah.
If we deliver the honest message, then they feel they're unhappy and we feel bad. We made them unhappy in our mind. Or we made them have that emotion, which as a therapist, you're trained right away to know, I have no control over other people's feelings. I mean, how you react to something is how you react to something. You have to own that. But in that moment, we do that. So we're being selfish and we're being dishonest. So I don't want to sugarcoat this. It's not, we're not being, oh, it's kind, it's good. You exceed expectation. No, that's not fair to them. And it's not fair to your rock stars. And what will happen over time is you'll have no more rock stars. You'll have all B's and C's. And then if someone comes in and says, we need to change performance around here, you're going to have to lay off a lot of people, which is going to be even more unpleasant than telling somebody they kind of missed the mark in 2022. Okay? So I'm going to jump in and say kind of how to structure this. So the first step is it's really, really important when we're talking about any kind of accountability. Before we even get to that conversation, you have got to make sure you did a really thorough job on clarity of expectations first. That's the first step. Don't go out there and say, hey, drive more sales. I told them to go get more sales. What does more sales mean? 2 more sales? 20 more sales? 20 more sales a day? Maybe it's not even number of sales. Maybe it's revenue dollars. 1 sale for $3 billion.
Wow,
what does that mean? So you need to make it really, really clear. And you need to make sure they agree. So when you say it, there's a couple ways to do it, but you got to make sure they replay back to you what they heard. So don't just talk and say, do you understand? And they go, yes. No, they were probably thinking about their laundry, what they're going to have for dinner that night. So either get them to repeat back to you what they heard. And you can do that in a nice way that doesn't sound patronizing. You don't want to say, repeat back to me what I said. That's something I might have said to my 5-year-olds that they probably wouldn't have tolerated even at 5 years old. So you want to say back to them, I want to make sure that I'm communicating clearly, because sometimes I think I am communicating clearly and then I don't always. So I'm just curious, when you think about what you heard me say, what really stood out for you? What really stuck with you? What did you hear? So there's some gentle ways you can get them to play it back. And then you want to follow up with some kind of an email. Like, here's what we talked about today. Here's what we agreed upon today. Okay, so it's also in writing. That will help. So we want that clarity. Now, that's the first step. Now, the ongoing regular communication is the second step. So depending upon what your expectations are, you need to find some regular moments where you can say, let's check in and see how you're doing, or what you might need from me. So if you set sales targets, maybe it's every month you check in and say, how you doing on those? Or every week, depending upon your business. I don't know. Or maybe you set, I don't know. So you set some other kind of target, like we'll go in healthcare. We set some kind of a quality of care scores. I don't know. And you kind of check in on those in a regular way. But finding some regular ways to check in on those and to be able to tell the person they're trending up, they're trending down, or they're right on target. We want to make sure we're having that regular communication, because you don't want any surprises. It's one of the reasons why Bob Sutton, who is a famous faculty member out in Stanford, used to say if performance reviews were a drug, they would not be FDA approved because 50% of the time after performance review, performance goes up and 50% of the time it goes down. And largely it's because there wasn't any ongoing conversations throughout the year. So folks felt surprised. They felt blindsided. They didn't really know what was coming. So we want to avoid all that. So the ongoing communication is really important. And then finally, our final C is candor. Be honest. If the person's missing the mark, say you're missing the mark. Now, for them to be ready to hear a candid conversation, we don't want to spring that on anyone. So you want to make sure they are ready for that. That is key for an honest, candid conversation. So this is what you do. You say, hey, I'd love to have a conversation with you about how things have shaped up this year. I think there's some opportunities that you could really dive into that could get you even better. And I want to give you some honest feedback. When would be a good time for us to have that conversation? Versus, springing it on somebody. Hey, you didn't know this, but today I'm going to deliver some really tough feedback to you. No one wants that meeting. That's anxiety producing. It's a surprise. They're not ready for it. Set it up as motivating, which is what it should be, and then have them work with you on picking the day and time. So you can have a structured conversation on that. And you can talk about what's been working, what hasn't been working, and then what they could do to kind of get to the next level. So I think that's those three ingredients. If everybody was doing that all the time, we wouldn't have the accountability problems we have. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to hit the mark or everybody's going to want to be held accountable. But by following that process, it's going to make it very, very clear when you have somebody who's just bucking against it. And then you can have a choice. You have a choice to make. You can say you either need to make some of these changes and commit to this, or if it's too much work, let me work with you to help you find another home. And they can, either exit on their own, or you can help them, find another role that might be a better fit.
Yeah. I feel like it's almost channeling a slightly nicer version of, is it Simon Cowell? Is that the? Don't tell someone.
I would hope a little more than slightly nicer than Simon Cowell.
Well,
you're talking about the American Idol judge?
Yes. Because he would tell you if you couldn't sing. So these poor people didn't go their whole lives trying to get a singing career. That's
true. He was honest about that.
Yes. Yes. But again, if you go through so many reviews thinking that you don't have very much to improve upon, at some point in your career, you're going to get a very rude awakening. And you're not going to understand why, because everyone told me I could sing. And now 10 years later, I can't.
That's true. So I love the fact you brought up Simon Cowell. And here's why.
Okay.
It makes me think about author editor again, because when we think about, if anyone's, hopefully everyone is nodding their head going, oh yeah, it's author editor. If you haven't heard me talk about author editor yet, and you're listening to this, go buy my book, go listen to one of our podcasts talking about it. You can listen to the audio version of the book. It's really, really important because we want to be sitting in the editor seat as leaders. And there's an important distinction. There is a difference between being an editor and a critic. Simon Cowell's a great critic. And the difference is when you're a critic, it's all about you. And Simon makes it very, very clear to everyone on that show and everyone viewing the show, it is all about Simon. He's going to deliver that feedback, but in a way that makes him look different or better. So when the critic is all about the critic, and they only use the red pen. So I'm holding up a red pen for folks listening. Can't see it. I got a red Sharpie in my hand. They only use this. They just beat you up. So there's no to add another C to our list. There's no compassion in how that candor is delivered. So we want to deliver it with compassion, and add another C, we want to be a coach. So we want to do it in a way that's motivating and inspiring. So we want to make it a little more yes and, like our friends in improv theater. We want to say, here's what you've done really well this year. Here's the big opportunity area where you missed the mark. Here's what you could do next year or starting tomorrow to kind of bridge this gap. But as it stands right now, this is you're behind where I think you could be, and I think where you want to be. We want to be honest in that way, but we want to be honest, candid, but we want to do it with compassion. We want to do it with an eye of coaching. I want to help you get better versus you can't sing. That was the worst performance and Simon would probably set it up like, I've been doing this job a very long time. And I've got to tell you, I've never heard anything quite like this before in my entire career.
That's exactly what
that was the worst experience I've ever had. I may even need to take a break after this because I'm still reeling from the pain in my eardrums. That's not how we deliver candor. We want to do it with compassion, which is really an eye on how do we coach this person, help this person. And if we do it that way, most people are going to really find that valuable and they're going to really feel respected. And then some people are going to love you for it. Because I have a client I was talking to yesterday, and he's a senior vice president, and he knows he's with the right leader when he has two things. The leader trusts him, and the leader gives him direct, honest feedback. And he's had leaders before at his level that don't give him direct, honest feedback. They play politics, because lots of politicians, when you start to get SVP and above, particularly in a really big organization, and it really drives him crazy, creates a lot of anxiety for him because he doesn't know where he stands. So you're really giving people a gift when you give feedback in this way and hold people accountable with an eye towards coaching and an eye towards helping them grow.
This is fantastic. Okay. So let's say you have done all of this. You've been very clear. You've communicated. You've even had the opportunity to have that candor conversation in whatever way that looks like within your company, right? So like some companies have a points system, or maybe, you keep track of how many conversations, if there's a repeated behavior that you don't like, how many times you've had to speak with that employee about it. Sometimes that employee is a direct report and you have the power within your organization to invite that person to leave and find a new home. Others, there's like this layering system. So what happens if you have someone on your team, you followed these steps, but you're actually in the middle? And so you've done all the tracking, you need this person to leave, but your manager is in charge of whether or not the process is actually followed and that person is let go.
Okay, so maybe you're like a colleague and you rely on this person for a lot of your work and they just keep dropping the ball and you've told your manager and they haven't really done anything about it. Is that kind of like a way we could add a little more color to this? Would that be
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And kind of specifically, you and I were talking a little bit offline, but we have a dear family friend that's experiencing this, and the way it works, which really points back to our prior episode where we were talking about culture. Safety is a really big value in their company. It's manufacturing. And so they have multiple buildings, and the individual that I know is a manager of one of the buildings. And so he's in charge of it. So he is the one actually, keeping count, having those conversations. And it can actually be very dangerous if someone isn't following the guidelines. But he has raised this to his management about a particular employee several times, and nothing has been done. So even though like the tax system, I guess you would call it, is followed, multiple conversations have been had with this employee, it doesn't really go anywhere outside of that one building. So the overall manager, that's where it stops. And it just feels like this repeated process where nothing actually happens. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So in situations like this, when you're kind of influencing the person that needs to drive the accountability, there's two things we want to bring to that conversation: choice and pain. Okay. Choice and pain. So let's start with pain first, and then we'll back up. The reason why they're not doing it. So I'm going to state the obvious, but this is the therapist in me. Human beings are not rational people. We're not rational. We're people, but we're not rational. we are emotional and we have history.
Mm.
So if we were all rational, if we were all Vulcans or we all robots, we would just have the conversation and move on, and the person would hear it and they would accept it and they'd move on. But we're afraid of how they're going to react, what's going to happen to us. We had some experience in our history, so we have pictured in our mind that there's going to be a lot of pain if we do this, pain for us, so we avoid it. Okay, so that's what's happening. So there's a clear path forward, but the person isn't doing it because they're afraid of that pain. They don't want to feel that discomfort. Okay, that's what's going on. So the first thing you want to do, but now we'll go back to choice. So the first thing you want to do is choice, and then we're going to set up how to work through pain. So choice, we need to be able to kind of explain to the person, here's what's happening. And then you want to be able to say, you have naturally, boss, leader, you've got some options. You don't have to have the conversation. But my fear is if we don't have the conversation, these are some different options that could happen down the road. So you want to be able to kind of lay out, like, you've got choices. One choice is you don't have the conversation. Another choice is you have the conversation, and then maybe there's another conversation you can have. So we kind of lay out options for them, because people always do better if they're feeling really resistant. And this is good, just general practice, even when you're trying to drive change in an organization. Give people that experience of choice. People feel like they have choice. They have a sense of agency. They don't feel as stuck or overwhelmed with change. Okay. So you say, yeah, you've got a choice. But here are some possible pain points that can happen if you do nothing. So if you do nothing, short term, you could start to see some talented people leave, because they're just not going to put up with this nonsense. They don't want to work with somebody that A, isn't being held accountable, B, is getting paid the same as them, delivering at a different level, and C, could actually hurt them.
Right.
So our first cost you could potentially encounter, first pain you could eventually encounter, is your rock stars out the door. So how are you going to run a business without them? You still got this person over here. He's not particularly great, but your real people you lean on, they're going to leave. Second thing that can happen is that could result in possible loss of customers. You could end up losing customers because of that disruption to the business, and you don't want that. And then third, maybe even more significant as pain, this could result in a lawsuit, a pretty massive one. If this person, and you could even lose your job. I would hate that for you, but that could potentially happen if there's a record of you being notified that there was safety issues. You didn't address it. Somebody gets hurt. They sue the company. You're going to be asked, why didn't you address this?
Right.
And there could be a lot of cost to the business for that as well. So kind of laying out pain that is trying to find a pain point that is higher than the pain point that is currently in their head. Because for whatever reason, they don't want to do this. And they've created this big story around it. So we've got to make the pain of not doing something. The monster in the closet is much scarier than the monster under the bed. We've got to kind of tell that story. So it's got to have that kind of that balance if we're trying to get that. Now, with everything, this is your influencing. They may still do nothing. And then you'll have to decide, are you comfortable living in an environment where people aren't held accountable?
Right.
And if you are an A player, A minus, A, or even A plus, anywhere in the A category, you're not going to want to tolerate that. Because your option is, it's not worth it to me to keep staying as an A player. It's like I drop down to a B player, but A players hate the idea of not being A players. It almost feels like sacrilegious to them to compromise on their own ability to deliver results.
Right.
So that's also something you'll have to consider.
I'd love to hear your take on this, because I know, I believe it's 1 billion where companies cease to be a company and they actually become a government.
3
billion.
3 billion. 3 billion. What 1 billion, they really move into full medium size to large kind of companies. 2 billion, they start to really build up systems and structures. It's often when they become acquisition targets, because they are perfect balance of nimble and creative and innovative with strong cultures usually, and good systems and structures. So I see a lot of companies, a lot of my clients that hit 2 billion get acquired, and then 3 billion, nice old government.
So where does this play out? Because it almost feels at some point it's like the revenue hides all sins, right? Like there could be a lot of problems happening somewhere, but because money's coming in, things aren't addressed.
Well, you're onto something real close. I wouldn't say revenue, size hides all sins.
Okay.
There's 5 of us working out of our garage in a startup, and you're not pulling your weight. The other 4 of us are going to be like, this isn't a good fit for you. You need to go. It's going to be obvious, right? There's just 5 of us.
Right.
When there's 55,000 of us, you can hide out. I have seen underperformers bob and weave inside big government entities, literal governments or companies that have now become governments for decades. They just shift from one manager to another, and they're never held accountable because the clarity isn't driven. It's still vague. And when it's vague, those folks know how to create smoke screens and gaslight and say, well, you never said this to me. I don't ever remember we talking about that. That was never in writing. And they're able to kind of avoid. So it's much more common in large organizations just because of the scale. So you'll see a lot of this in those size organizations. Or I shouldn't say a lot. It's more common in those. So we have to be a little more intentional and make sure, again, the way you do it is make sure you put it in writing. That's really important. And this would be emails. Make sure you've got a document chain. Otherwise, folks that are really skilled at this, they know how to say, well, we didn't talk about that. I never heard that. That wasn't, I don't remember that. So we want it in writing.
Yeah. And I assume that's probably the same for hybrid teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I had a leader I was working with, and his whole team was virtual during the pandemic, and they finally got a new office. And given the nature of their work, they really need to be in person. So he had hired a bunch of people virtually during all that time and a couple of years, brought them all in together, and he said, "Wow, it was really telling." Because I could sit here and I saw one person just rocking, just working on stuff. They were working on cases. They were doing some kind of just research and a little bit of forensic kind of work in this business. He said, this one person just going case after case after case. This other person is just drinking coffee, watching them. And he said, I would never have been able to tell the difference in performance levels when they're working virtually or hybrid. But once I saw them actually in person and saw them working, I could see this person's an A plus, that person's a C plus. Now they may have potential to be a B plus or even an A, and maybe I just didn't coach them and they just didn't know that was our culture because they were working remote. But it became a lot more apparent. So yeah, you really want to make sure we're really good on the clarity and that regular communication and even candor. It's probably almost more important for our virtual and hybrid colleagues because you're just not, you're working, you don't have that extra set of data. You don't have that experience of seeing them work, noticing when they come into work every day, noticing when they leave. I mean, those are some of those things that we take for granted when we work with people physically.
Right.
You can't really see that, tell when people are working virtually.
Right. So as an executive leader navigating this, then, is there something we can test against to make sure we're keeping this in balance? Because when I think of this from the standpoint of the rock star could be upset when others are not held accountable, but the rock star also doesn't want someone hanging over their shoulder at all times. So I feel like there's a balance between holding those accountable and then also not examining every little detail of every second of every day.
A really good book that people should consider that might help them is The Author versus Editor Dilemma. Look, you have a copy right there. The Leadership Secret to Unlocking Your Team, Your Time, and Your Impact. So that would help. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if we're working with a rock star, okay, or someone who has rock star potential, and Whitney, you made an important distinction here. I'm giving general accountability principles for managers. You said for an executive leader. So if you're talking executive leader, now we're higher up in the pyramid. Folks at that level have all delivered high results at some point. Okay, and
Right.
that doesn't mean that they're not that they're always accountable. You can have folks that don't want to do things you ask them to do. Okay, but they all deliver high results. They are natural authors. Okay, and so our rock stars, the traits of the natural author is three. They take ownership, they show initiative, they display critical thinking. The higher the altitude in the business or organization, the more you're going to find that it's a common trait along with everybody. They all take ownership, they all show initiative, they all display critical thinking. You can't get to executive roles if you can't do those things. Okay, just okay. So if you want to hold someone like that accountable, still have the candor with them, but you tell them to go come up with a plan and bring it back to you. And that's driving more of that authorship, that ownership, initiative, and critical thinking. They're not going to like you telling them because it's going to feel patronizing and micromanaging, like you don't trust them or you don't think they're smart enough to figure this out. So have them go off and come up with a plan and bring it back to you. Say, here's the issue. Why don't you come up with a plan and bring it back to me and let's talk about it. Let's reach agreement and let's commit.
So good.
Yeah, that's the key. And the key with executives, the nice thing is you don't have to, your folks should be able to create plans and identify the how. You just need to make sure you hold them accountable to the deadlines or commitments that they make to you. So if they say, I'm gonna have this conversation, or I'm gonna, do this difficult thing at the end of the month, then you hold them. You say, okay, let's set a meeting for the first of the next month, so we can talk about how it went. Create those mechanisms to drive a little more of that accountability.
That's great.
And if they're not meeting the deadline, then they need to also discuss why. So we think about our friends in IT implementations. It's hard to hit some of those deadlines. There's usually factors outside of their control that happen. And so those go live dates don't always go live. And so that's okay, but then that IT leader needs to be able to communicate and articulate to their leader why it didn't go the way it was supposed to, what they maybe didn't anticipate that happened, what they're gonna do to remediate that, and then what their new revised plan is going forward. So again, put that authorship on your rock stars. They can handle it.
That's so good. It just culminates at the fact that we're not, I think you said, rational humans, right? I mean, as team members, we just want to come in, do our job, be recognized for a job well done, get everybody holding us back out of our way. And leaders just want good team members. Can we just all get along, Brandon?
I know. Now, last thing I'll add, and then we can close. I almost shouldn't open this can of worms, but I'm going to anyway. You can hold that same process of clarity, ongoing communication, and candor with your kiddos, because we want to hold them accountable too. Any good parent should. You find a parent that doesn't hold their kids accountable, you're going to find some really bad kids. And that's really what, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find some kids that are feel entitled, do victim mindset. They do all that kind of stuff. It's not going to be good for them in their careers and, more importantly, in their life. So accountability. That being said, be prepared for your kids to not meet their agreed upon commitments. That is part of the learning process. And so you're going to have to work through that in your own way, because you can't fire them. In your own way, how do we compassionately but firmly have that conversation and say, let's talk about what didn't go the way we talked about it going and what you're going to do to fix it and put it back on track. But push that ownership and initiative and critical thinking on your kiddos, because that is frankly the best gift you can give them. If they leave your nest with a sense of ownership and initiative and critical thinking as they enter into the world's their oyster. They walk into the world as a victim and feel entitled and everyone else's fault. As we'd say in the South, a hot mess is in store for them. So you can use the same process with your kids. Just give yourself a lot of grace and patience, because it's not going to go quite as cleanly as it does with grown adults.
Well, I'll give you a plug, Brandon, because we have an article that you wrote up on myleadershipfoundry.com, which is 4 things great parents can teach leaders. And you mentioned that in there, and you say in there that hard things teach us lessons. Parenting is hard. And so in that is, here's things you've learned as being a parent that you can apply in leadership. And I think that's a great tie-in. I mean, that's perfect, because it does. I mean, in a way, no, probably shouldn't compare parents to employees or kids to employees. Another can of worms.
Yeah. Well,
Another can of worms.
Employees are a lot easier. Let me just tell you that. Usually you only have to tell them once. And kids, it's usually 2, 3, 4, 5 times.
Over a span of years.
Yes. Yes.
That's good.
Well, Whitney, this was great. Thank you for joining me today. I'm glad we got to take on a really important and valuable topic today for all managers and leaders. Many of us are doing it well. Some of us maybe have some opportunity, but it's just probably a good refresher. Let's think about those 3 C's: clarity, ongoing communication, and candor. And then, we can add in a couple other layered on at the end with compassion and coaching on the back end of that. But if we follow those C's, we're going to make it a lot easier. And if you follow those C's and make it fairly clear to your folks that you're doing that, it makes it a process. And when things are a process, they're not taken personally. But when there's no process, people think we're attacking them, we're going after them, we're picking on them. So by making it a process, we can show it's fair and it's not personal. And that will also help us and help them as we're having these important conversations.
Yep, I agree. It's great, Brandon.
Thanks, Whitney. So as we always do with all these Leadership Foundry podcasts, the goal of this show, just like all of our shows, is for you to hopefully be a little entertained, but most importantly, come away with a tool or two you can put in your toolkit to help you and your teams, starting today, get a little bit better for tomorrow.